Welcome to a new video. This topic, public transportation.
Mic check 1 2 1 2. 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 I got a new flavor coffee. I got an old flavor rap. Equip the A1 tones to make.
If you live in the United States, you know that public transportation is pretty non-existent or lackluster in most of the country. I mean, let's be honest. Have you seen the way our cities are built?
Well, you know, Jeff and Pat, makes you want to not just drive.
Out here, it's usually nothing more than a sign on a pole, or even on this one, there's just a sign on a pole with no information, no bus route, no schedule, just a number over here to call for the dial-a-ride.
The study shows that drivers stuck at traffic lights were exposed to 29 times more harmful pollution particles than those driving in free-flowing traffic.
And things aren't too different here in the Motor City, where cars are made, but not actually, because cars are manufactured in other countries where there's cheaper labor costs and production costs. And public transportation infrastructure is pretty non-existent except for some light rail transit and some bus routes that don't expand further out from the city. There also is an Amtrak line, but it's pretty expensive and not consistent enough for public transportation. But what if I told you that Detroit actually had one of the most advanced plans for transit in the country? So let's take a look at Detroit's plan and execution of mass transportation. By the early 1920s, the political leaders of Detroit didn't even address the issue of transportation until they controlled the most used transportation at the time, which were streetcars. But what's actually quite surprising is that some Detroit automakers, such as Ford at the time, were in support of city-owned railways. And this makes sense because at the time, public transportation was the best way that workers could get from their homes to factories and plants for their jobs. In March 1922, the Detroit United Railway finally sold their property to the city. And by December 1922, the new mayor James Cosens created the Detroit Rapid Transit Commission, otherwise known as the RTC. With the railways finally owned by the city, the mayor needed to appoint someone for the head of the commission. Sidney D. Walden was appointed as the president of the Transit Commission, but before his work in the commission, he also was the vice president of Parkland Automotive. But even with his hands deep into the automotive industry, Walden constantly advocated for rapid transit systems in Detroit, with subways being at the center of the system. But unfortunately for Mr. Walden, most of the country's urban planners did not even care for his ideas. Most urban planners at the time didn't care about subways or light rail transit, and they opted actually for improving the automobile transit system. But finally, in November 1923, voters empowered the RTC to solve their transportation needs with light rail transit. And this is when the RTC created their most innovative plan for transportation. They planned to build 225 of so-called super highways. These superhighways carried rapid transit lines and subways in the central business district. This system would have 21 superhighways, with 85% of it being outside of Detroit. These superhighways would be 204 feet wide, but they would be built on pre-existing major wide roads. The system would be built on a grid system 3 to 4 miles apart from each superhighway. 6 of the superhighways would be used for high volumes of traffic. These streets would be Fort Street, Michigan Avenue, Grand River Avenue, Northwestern Highway, and Gratiot River Avenue. These were planned to have a double-deck structure which would have 8 lanes of automobile traffic and a center median lane for light rail transit. While many transportation planners were amazed by the superhighway design, most of the planners only saw the improvements that they could make for car-centric roads. With this in mind, Walden was not done fighting. In 1924, Walden wrote to the Chicago Tribune saying that motor vehicles are for the rich man, which would come with unusual development and enormous economies in manufacturing. He also claimed that automobiles were inefficient and clogged the streets. And this is really interesting because Walden recognized the issues of cars way before they changed the entire transportation infrastructure, and many of the issues that people have today have relation to what Walden stated nearly 100 years ago.
Take him to Detroit. No! No, not Detroit!
Now, honestly, I was going to continue about the failures of the RTC until the inevitable creation of the highway. Now, I think it would be much more interesting to see the roads and the environment of these places where the superhighways were originally planned to be built. Here, I'm standing in front of the CPA building in Corktown. This was originally the home of the Conductors Protective Association, a union for train workers, and naturally, the CPA was built in front of the Michigan Central Station. But the CPA building is one of the few last survivors of a city's history that is now long gone. Many buildings like it have been destroyed to widen lanes to fix congestion. The City Plan Commission reported in 1946. It was observed that an increased number of traffic lanes made possible by street widening intensified congestion at intersections. Although streetcars ran down Detroit Avenue until 1950, the hope for a mass rapid transit never happened. Since most traffic now goes through highways, the widened lanes of Michigan Avenue are hardly unutilized. Corktown was not the only part of Detroit that was affected by these changes. Many cities that were built in the future adopted these wide lanes and roads for a car-centric culture. Parking lots now litter the cities, the pedestrians are uncared for, and no improvements are planned for the far future. While highways plowed through many homes and establishments that people once lived in, they also created a car-centric culture that destroyed communities from the ground. Personally, I don't think Walden was wrong for being persistent in implementing subways in Detroit, although his persistence was probably a factor in the failure of the RTC. Walden knew that streets would become clogged as more people would be driving, and the automobile transit would not be nearly as efficient as already existing infrastructure. And we can even see that today. I-75, a major north-south highway in Detroit, always has some sort of construction, closing the lanes down to 2. Which this kind of already shows that we could implement a transit along the highways by closing lanes. As more people take light rail transit, theoretically there would be fewer people on the roads. But the same issue Walden faced in the 1920s is still the same issue 100 years later.
Money.
And how do we fund construction costs for these costly train lines and infrastructure? Although some would say that there was already an excess funding into another part of the government that could be used for something else.
Look at the bright side. For once, the American taxpayer is getting a good deal on a defense contract. Man, the American taxpayer.
Another solution would be to update the current Amtrak lines that are already being used in Detroit. Making the trains more frequent and accessible and linking them to a consistent bus schedule would greatly improve the people's needs for public transportation. And currently the city of Detroit has a plan for transportation called the Detroit Strategic Plan for Transportation. In the plan, it only speaks of improving roads and bus routes with our focus of transportation needs. But everyone knows that no matter how much you improve the bus and bus routes, as long as the same amount of cars are on the road and the same traffic as buses, it amounts to nothing. And the Michigan 2045 Long Range Plan, which is the state's transportation plan, seems to be focused on mostly maintenance and improving the infrastructure of transportation. Just a quick note, I actually looked back at the Michigan Transportation Plan, and there actually are improvements for rails, so just disregard my entire rant. Even though Walden and the RTC failed in implementing the proper mass transit, there is still hope for the future. And if you live in Detroit, luckily for us, the Detroit Department of Transportation holds meetings frequently to hear the public opinion on future improvements. I can't really say how effective these public meetings are, but our voices need to be heard about the public's transportation needs, and this is definitely a step in the right direction for change. Although automotive manufacturers may have a huge grasp in the city, a step towards a car-free future is what will benefit Detroit the most.
We interrupt this program to bring you the preview. Do you like flowers? Well, lucky for you, join me in the next video where I'm going to flower bomb the city with native flowers.